Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 169 and it's titled Boromir Artifacts Hope. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Richard over on Discord/Patreon, and that card is Throne of Empires. So Throne of Empires is 4 mana for an artifact. You can pay 1, tap it, and put a 1/1 white soldier creature token onto the battlefield. Put 5 of those tokens onto the battlefield instead if you control artifacts named Crown of Empires and Scepter of Empires. So obviously, since we have Throne of Empires, we are also playing the Crown and the Scepter. So the Crown is 2 mana for an artifact, pay 3, tap target creature, gain control of that creature instead if you control artifacts named Scepter of Empires and Throne of Empires, and then the Scepter is 3 mana for an artifact, tap, Scepter of Empires deals 1 damage to target player, it deals 3 damage to that player instead if you control artifacts named Crown of Empires and Throne of Empires. So a little bit unique in the sense that we really want to be built around 3 specific artifacts, and we don't have a ton of ways to search them out on a budget. So I decided to, of course, add some colors. We can't be a colorless deck for this one, I don't think. So we added blue and white to it, and we are playing an artifact commander, but I think it's actually a commander that most people see as a human commander, because that is Boromir, Gondor's Hope. And Boromir is 2 white-blue for a 3/4 legendary creature human warrior. Whenever Boromir, Gondor's Hope, enters the battlefield or attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a human or artifact card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So yes, Boromir can get humans, and we do have a couple of humans in here, but he's really here because he lets us dig 6 cards deep into our library whenever he enters or attacks, so we don't actually have to play a ton of tutor effects to try to find all 3 pieces of our main random cards. We can instead use Boromir as a way to just kind of dig through our entire deck and eventually find them and play them. So that is the main goal with this deck and why we're playing Boromir as the commander. But we of course got to talk about some of our themes for this deck. Now, first off, since Boromir is an enter the battlefield trigger, we're kind of leaning into that with a bunch of other creatures that enter the battlefield and have some sort of effect. For example, we have Thought Monitor, which is 6 and a blue for a 2/2 artifact creature construct. It has affinity for artifacts, so it costs 1 generic mana less for each artifact we control. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards. So if we happen to have 6 artifacts in play, we could cast Thought Monitor for just a single blue. It then enters, we draw 2 cards, and that's a pretty powerful effect, so we really wanted to load up on creatures that enter and trigger like that. And the main reason why we're loading up on that is for theme number 2, which is blink effects. We want to be able to exile our creatures and return them to play, being able to trigger their abilities again. So that means Boromir can dig for more cards, Thought Monitor can draw more cards, and we're using cards like Abuelo, Ancestral Echo, which is 1 white and a blue for a 2/2 legendary creature spirit. He's got flying and ward 2, and you can pay 1 blue, white to exile another target creature or artifact you control, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Notably, there are a ton of ways to exile a creature and return it to play, but we really wanted to try to focus on cards that care about exiling creatures or artifacts because we have a ton of artifacts in the deck that want to do something when they enter, which is, of course, theme number 3, artifacts that have enter the battlefield effects. So Wedding Invitation here, for example, is 2 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. You can tap, sacrifice it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. If it's a vampire, it also gains lifelink until the end of turn. So this kind of pulls double duty in this deck because as it enters, we get to draw a card. So if we have something like Abuelo, we can consistently exile it, bring it back, draw more cards, but we can also sacrifice it so that Boromir can't be blocked, meaning we can get his ability again if we really need it. So Wedding Invitation does do quite a bit in this deck, but this is the main highlight of what we're trying to do. We really just want to play creatures and artifacts that trigger when they enter the battlefield, and then we want to find ways to exile them and bring them back, getting those triggers over and over and over. So with all of that being said, let's jump into some of our key cards and talk about some of the main powerhouses in this deck. The first of those key cards is going to be Cryptic Coat. And this doesn't look like too much on the outside, but once you really see it synergizing with all the other pieces of this deck, it actually becomes one of the best cards in the entire deck. Because Cryptic Coat is 2 and a blue for an artifact equipment. When Cryptic Coat enters the battlefield, cloak the top card of your library, then attach Cryptic Coat to it. So essentially that means we just take the top card of our library, put it face down on the battlefield as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2, and if it's a creature, we can pay its mana cost to flip it face up at any time. Notably, it also has equipped creature, gets +1/+0 and can't be blocked, and we can pay 1 and a blue to return Cryptic Coat to its owner's hand. Because we have so many blink effects and exile effects and returning things to the battlefield, Cryptic Coat is one of the fastest ways to generate value because we can blink the Cryptic Coat, then we get to cloak the top card of our library again, meaning that for every time we are blinking the coat, we are getting another 2/2 creature. And then once those creatures are in play, if they're a permanent, we can actually blink the face down permanent and it will return face up. So for example, if we put a land under it, we can't flip it up. We can blink it, get it back as a land, and we've ramped. We could also get a giant creature that maybe we can't pay for the mana cost to come back in. We could get an artifact. We could get an enchantment. All of these things we wouldn't be able to flip up normally. We now can because of the blink and the flicker effects. So this essentially allows us to cheat on mana cost and get a lot of value out of our cards because our opponents have no idea what to expect and we don't have to pay full price for pretty much any of them. So Cryptic Coat really is the MVP of this deck, and I think if I had to pick one card that I would say is probably the best, it is Cryptic Coat. It is, of course, however, not the only key card we're going to be talking about, because I also want to highlight Thousand Moon Smithy. And Thousand Moon Smithy is 2 white for a legendary artifact. When it enters the battlefield, create a white gnome soldier artifact creature token with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control. And at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may tap 5 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control. If you do, transform Thousand Moon Smithy. So just on the front side, we can pay 4 mana and make an absolutely giant creature because we will most likely have a ton of creatures or a ton of artifacts. It's not out of the ordinary for a Thousand Moon Smithy to come down and immediately make a 10/10, 11/11, a 12/12 creature. And then, if we're able to transform it, it transforms into Barracks of the Thousand, which is a legendary artifact land. It can tap to add a white mana, and whenever you cast an artifact or creature spell using mana produced by Barracks of the Thousand, create another of the white gnomes that has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control. So that is allowing us every single turn to continuously make those gnome creature tokens and generate a giant army that our opponents are not going to be able to stop, because if they can't really stop one 12/12, what are they going to do against 12 12/12s? So there's not a ton that our opponents can do to stop it, and yes, they don't have any natural evasion, they don't have trample or vigilance or anything like that, but being able to just make an army of giant creatures is really going to prevent our opponents from doing pretty much anything. And then finally, we got to talk about our last key card, and this one is going to be Displacer Kitten. When we're talking about blink and flicker effects, Displacer Kitten is by far the best repeatable one in the entire deck, because it is 3 and a blue for a 2/2 cat beast, and it has avoidance. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, exile up to one target non-land permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Essentially, this is a free blink effect every single time we cast an artifact, which of course there's a ton of in this deck. So being able to cast one artifact, trigger Displacer Kitten, blink another artifact, get both ETB triggers again, is incredibly powerful when we really don't have to spend any extra mana or any extra card slots on it. We can just play our game plan as normal and slowly outvalue the rest of the table. So I probably don't need to talk too much about how good Displacer Kitten is. As you can see by the price tag, it is one of the more expensive cards in the deck just because it is incredibly powerful, but I do think it is definitely worth the include if you're able to squeeze it in. Now, with all of that being said, we're going to move on to the next part of our deck tech, which is going to be talking about some cool interactions. And these are cards that synergize really well together and sometimes are just fun cards that I like to highlight. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be between Combat Thresher and Teleportation Circle. So Combat Thresher is 7 mana for an artifact creature construct. It's a 3/3, has double strike, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Now, you might be thinking that 7 mana is a little bit steep for that kind of effect, so you could also cast it for its prototype cost, which is 2 and a white, and that makes it enter as a 1/1 creature, but it does still have double strike and draws a card when it enters. The nice thing about the Combat Thresher is that if we have it in play for its prototype cost, and then we blink it or exile it and bring it back, it comes back as the 7 mana cost, so it's a 3/3. And so a good way that we can guarantee that is with Teleportation Circle, which is 3 and a white for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, exile up to one target artifact or creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Being able to play Combat Thresher for 3 mana and then play Teleportation Circle, when we've already drawn one card off of Combat Thresher, we then exile it, draw another card off of it when it re-enters, and now it's a 3/3 with double strike instead of a 1/1, meaning that it's doing quite literally triple the damage. So that is something that is incredibly powerful, and we do have a couple of other prototype cards in the deck as well to take advantage of this synergy, but Combat Thresher is probably the best one because of the card draw that's stapled onto it. But of course, any of them are going to be very powerful with repeated blink effects like Teleportation Circle. The second cool interaction that I want to talk about is going to be between Kappa Cannoneer and Psi Master Thopterist. So these two cards are very powerful on their own, and both of them probably could have been in our key cards section, but I did want to specifically highlight the way that they synergize together. So Kappa Cannoneer is 5 and a blue for a 4/4 artifact creature turtle warrior. It also has Improvise, Ward 4, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer, and it can't be blocked this turn. A couple of things to highlight about this card. Each artifact we tap can pay for a generic mana in its cost, so we could cast it for a single blue. And it specifically says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, since Kappa Cannoneer is an artifact, it actually does trigger itself, so it will enter already with a +1/+1 counter and be a 5/5, which is very important to the card overall. And the reason that we're going to compare that with Psi Master Thopterist is because he is 2 and a blue for a 1/4 legendary creature human artificer. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying, and you can pay 1 and a blue, sacrifice 2 artifacts, and draw a card. So the reason I wanted to specifically highlight these two cards together is because whether you play them with Kappa Cannoneer first and then Psi, or Psi first and Kappa Cannoneer second, it actually doesn't matter because they're both incredibly synergistic with each other. So for example, if we cast Kappa Cannoneer first and then Psi, every artifact we cast after that point is going to generate a Thopter. That Thopter is an artifact that's entering the battlefield, putting a +1/+1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer, being able to make it unblockable, and making a huge threat that our opponents are going to have a really tough time dealing with, especially because it has Ward 4. So even if they want to cast a 1 mana removal spell, it's going to cost them 5 mana just to get rid of it, which is a very difficult thing to ask. If we were to cast it the other way around, and we have Sai on board first and then Kappa Cannoneer, there's a good chance that we've made enough Thopters that we can actually just use the Thopters to improvise out the Kappa Cannoneer, paying only 1 mana for it, which then makes another Thopter, and then we're able to continue casting more spells because in theory, we only spent 1 mana out of however much we may have. So these two really just create so much value with Kappa Cannoneer being a threat, and then Sai making a ton of Thopters that could also be a threat, also drawing us cards if we need to. So like I said, these two really could be absolute MVPs of the deck and probably deserve to be in the key card section, but I did want to highlight how they work together in a separate section of this, so that's why they wound up in our cool interactions. But with all of that being said, we're going to move to the final portion of our deck tech, which is the budget section of the deck, and this week our deck came in at $76.70, which is pretty far under our budget limit. And the most expensive card in the entire deck wound up being Cyber Drive Awakener at a massive $8.62. So obviously, Cyber Drive Awakener is an incredibly powerful card if it's maintaining that price tag. If you do need to trim it and get the deck below $70, this would be the card to cut. But it is 5 and a blue for a 4/4 artifact creature construct. It has flying. Other artifact creatures you control have flying. And, the most important part, when it enters the battlefield until the end of turn, each non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/4. So essentially, we can use Cyberdrive Awakener as a way to just completely win the game out of nowhere. If we have filled up the board with little artifacts, maybe they're signets, maybe they're cards that when they enter they draw us a card like Wedding Invitation, and then all of a sudden they become 4/4 creatures that all have flying, our opponents are probably not prepared for that massive swing and may not have a ton of blockers because flying is going to get them through most of the board. So Cyberdrive Awakener really does deserve the price that it has. The price tag is a little bit expensive, but I do think it's deserved. However, like I said earlier, if you do need to trim down the budget of the deck, you could cut Cyberdrive Awakener. We do have similar effects in the deck, although they are not quite as efficient. They don't give flying, so that is something you can do. However, I would recommend keeping it in if possible. And of course, talking about budget, I do also have a suggestion for a card that I would put into the deck that is a little bit outside of our price range, and a card I would replace it with if given the chance. So normally, when we're looking at a deck cost of like $76 and I say out of budget, it's not actually out of budget. We could probably squeeze it in. I just like to include not necessarily every out of budget card that we could, but with this deck, this is actually out of budget. Putting this card in would push us over $100, which is impressive considering we're $24 below our limit. So, without any further ado, the card I would recommend putting in would be Simulacrum Synthesizer, and I would recommend taking out Against All Odds. So, starting with Simulacrum Synthesizer and why it commands a massive $31 price tag, it is 2 and a blue for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2, so it's an artifact with an enter the battlefield effect, which is perfect. And whenever another artifact with mana value 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Since we are planning to play a ton of artifacts and then blink them and exile them, return them to play, maybe recasting things, this is going to be triggering a lot. And if we've already talked about Thousand Moon Smithy being able to do it at least once a turn, Simulacrum Synthesizer being able to do it multiple times a turn is incredibly powerful and is one of the fastest ways for us to win the game. Now, like I said, it is also very expensive. It is $30, but if you do want to include it, you would of course have to take a card out, and the card I would recommend taking out is Against All Odds, which is 3 and a white for a sorcery, choose one or both, Exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and return target artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, I do want to preface this by saying Against All Odds is not a bad card. It is, in fact, a very good card in this deck, but the way that artifacts synergize with each other means that pretty much every card in our deck is very powerful, and it's very difficult to actually cut a card out to replace it with something like Simulacrum Synthesizer. So, with that being said, if you can't cut it, or you don't have a Simulacrum Synthesizer, or you just don't want to spend the money on it, Against All Odds is still a phenomenal card and is still very strong in this deck. The reason that I recommended replacing this one over anything else is simply because it's a 4 mana blink effect at sorcery speed. And yes, you can blink something and also reanimate something, which is very powerful, but 4 mana at sorcery speed means that we're not really going to be holding up the interaction that our deck wants to be holding up. That means that we're not going to be protecting our creatures or our artifacts. We won't have a counterspell ready. We won't have, something like an Aetherize ready, anything like that. And so for that reason alone, I think it's worth the cut. I really want our sorceries in this deck to make a huge impact, and I think Against All Odds can do that. But unfortunately, the floor of it is we have no creatures in play, we have no creatures in the graveyard, and then it's just doing nothing. Whereas if we have no creatures in play, no creatures in the graveyard, and we play Simulacrum Synthesizer, at least we would still get to scry 2. It at least still does something. So that is why this is the swap I would recommend. But like I said, if you're keeping it as is, Against All Odds is still a phenomenal card and still does a very good job pulling its own weight in this deck. So, with all of that being said, we're going to move on to the gameplay portion of the video where we're going to test out our deck against some others to see how it performs. But of course, before we get to that, I do want to take a second to shout out some of our patrons and channel members, and also show you some ways that you can help support the channel if you're interested in doing so. As always, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. We are so close to 1,200 subscribers, which is an absolutely mind-blowing number to me. So thank you all so much for all of your support, and of course a huge special shout out to all of our patrons and channel members. So thank you to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Wack, Richard, Devin Purser, and Brian Haney. To the 12 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And of course, if you would like to join those amazing people listed below, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and you can find us right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get a ton of awesome benefits. So, without rambling too much about that, let's move on to our gameplay section of this video and test out our deck against 3 opponents. So this week, we are being joined by Richard, playing John Irenicus Shattered One, Cole being played Pantlaza Sunfavored, and Doodle playing Tristani Selesnia's Voice. So starting off with Richard's John Irenicus deck, this is his Poltergeist deck, his haunting, horror-themed deck. Basically, what he wants to do is play as many huge demons that have these massive drawbacks, and then give them away to his opponents, forcing his opponents to beat each other down with them because they can't be sacrificed, and then also because they're goated. Now, it is worth mentioning that he's played this deck before, and it is very powerful, but he has been very vocal about the fact that it kind of falls off in the late game, and it's very difficult to actually win with, because you're giving your opponents giant creatures that are goated, and once it gets down to one-on-one, they can still attack him. So I'm very interested to see what he's got going on. I know he's made a couple of upgrades to the deck, so I'm interested to see if he's found some way to kind of negate that end of the game issue. But overall, this is a very powerful deck. I've definitely lost to it before, so I'm very excited to see it again. Next up, we have Cole and his Pantlaza deck. I believe that he said this is his first time playing this deck, so we're going to kind of see how the dinosaurs function. I know Pantlaza is a very powerful commander. Being able to discover every time a dinosaur enters, at least once per turn, is a very powerful effect. Being able to cast stuff for free is always very strong. So I'm very interested to see how Pantlaza works, and I think that the discovering X, where X is the creature's toughness, is either going to cause Cole to cast a lot of ramp spells because those are what's less than the toughness, or he's going to get lucky and just hit some absolutely massive dinosaurs. And either way, I think it's going to make for a super fun game. I think Discover's a super fun mechanic, so I'm very interested to see how it functions in Commander. And then last but not least, we have Doodle with Tristani. And of course, Doodle got to bring in a absolutely wild brew for this one. So this is a Selesnya Reanimator deck. He really wants to take advantage of the populate effect from Tristani because there's a ton of effects in green and white that exile a card from a graveyard to make a token copy of it. So he wants to put giant creatures into his graveyard or enter the battlefield creatures into his graveyard and then exile them to get copies so he can constantly populate those copies, which I think is a super unique build of Tristani and a super fun concept. So I'm super excited to see what he can do with that build because every time Doodle has a very unique style of deck, it always winds up being very effective and very fun to see. So with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments what your prediction for this video is. Let me know who you think is going to walk out the winner. Let me know whose deck you think is going to perform the best. And then of course at the end of it, let me know which deck you think was the MVP of the game. But as always, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But let's jump into the game. I hope you all enjoy it, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Richard goes first, followed by Cole, myself, and then Doodle. On Richard's first turn, he plays a Relentless Reef. Cole plays a Cavern of Souls, naming dinosaurs, so all his dinosaurs cast with the land can't be countered. I play a Plains. Doodle plays a Temple of Plenty, scrying 1. Richard plays a Mutavault and casts Dimir Signet. Cole plays a Forest. I play an Island and cast Azorius Signet. Doodle plays a Plains. Richard casts a Worn Power Stone, then plays a Dimir Aqueduct, returning Mutavault to his hand. Cole plays a Mountain. I play a Plains and cast my commander Boromir, Gondor's Hope, so whenever he enters or attacks, I look at the top 6 cards of my library and reveal an artifact or human, putting it into my hand. With this trigger, I put Scepter of Empires into my hand. Then, at the end of turn, Doodle cast Eladamri's Call, searching his library for a creature, in this case Farhaven Elf, putting it into his hand. Then, on Doodle's turn, he plays an Overgrown Farmland and casts the Farhaven Elf, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Richard plays the Mutavault and casts his commander John Irenicus Shattered One, letting him, in his end step, give control of a creature he controls to an opponent, putting 2+1/+1 counters on it and goading it for the rest of the game. He then casts Xenic Poltergeist, which can tap to turn a non-creature artifact into a creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value. Cole plays a Canopy Vista. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Cole for 3 with Boromir, triggering his ability and letting me reveal Sai Master Thopterus from the top of my library, putting it into my hand. In my second main phase, I play a Plains and cast Sai Master Thopterus, letting me make a 1/1 Thopter token whenever I cast an artifact. After that, I cast Prize Statue, making a Thopter and making a treasure when it enters the battlefield. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Vorinclex, searching his library for 2 forests and putting them into his hand. Richard plays a Swamp and casts Archfiend of Spite, making an opponent either lose life or sacrifice permanents equal to the damage they deal to it. Then, at the end of turn, Richard gives control of the Archfiend to Cole, tapping it, putting 2+1/+1 counters on it, and goading it for the rest of the game. Cole plays a Command Tower and casts his commander Pantlaza Sunfavored, letting him discover X once per turn when a dinosaur enters under his control, where X is the toughness of the dinosaur. In this case, he discovers 4 for Pantlaza, getting to cast a Thrashing Brontodon from the top of his library, which can sacrifice itself to destroy an artifact or enchantment. After that, he attacks me for 8 with the Archfiend of Spite, drawing Richard a card, and I block with my Thopter, killing it and losing 1 life since I dealt 1 damage to the demon. At the end of turn, Richard activates Xenic Poltergeist, turning my treasure into a 0/0 creature, automatically killing it. On my turn, I attack Richard for 3 with Boromir, putting an Ichor Wellspring into my hand from among the top 6 cards of my library. In my second main phase, I cast the Ichor Wellspring, making a Thopter and drawing a card when it enters. I also cast Sky Scanner, making another Thopter and drawing another card when it enters. Finally, I play a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1. Doodle plays a Fortified Village, revealing a forest from his hand so that it comes into play untapped. He then casts Eternal Witness, returning Eladamri's Call from his graveyard to his hand when it enters. Richard plays a Swamp and casts Liliana's Contract, drawing 4 cards and losing 4 life. Notably, he also wins the game in his upkeep if he ever controls 4 demons with different names. He also cast Abyssal Persecutor, preventing himself from winning the game and preventing his opponents from losing the game, but at the end of turn, he gives control of it to Doodle, tapping it, goading it, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Cole plays a Plains and attacks Doodle for 8 with the Archfiend of Spite, drawing Richard a card. Doodle blocks with Vorinclex, but before damage, he uses it to convoke a Chord of Calling for X = 3, searching his library for a creature with mana value 3 or less, putting it into play. This lets him put Pulse Mage Advocate into play, which can tap to return a creature from his graveyard to play, while also returning 3 cards from an opponent's graveyard to their hand. Then damage happens, killing Vorinclex while Doodle takes 5, since he dealt 5 damage to the Archfiend. In his second main phase, Cole casts Rhythm of the Wild, preventing his creatures from being countered and giving them all Riot. On my turn, I cast a Thought Monitor, making a Thopter and drawing 2 cards when it enters. I then move to combat, attacking Doodle for 3 with Boromir, and Cole for 3 with my Thopters. This triggers Boromir, letting me put Thousand Moon Smithy into my hand from among the top 6 cards of my library. In my second main phase, I cast the Thousand Moon Smithy, making a Thopter and a Gnome Soldier with power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts I control, which is currently 10. I then play an Azorius Chancery, returning a Plains to my hand. Doodle plays a Forest and casts his commander, Tristani Selesnia's Voice, letting him gain life equal to the toughness of each other creature that enters under his control. He then casts Sundering Growth, destroying my Ichor Wellspring, letting me draw a card and letting Doodle populate, but he doesn't have a token to copy. This does, though, let him activate Pulse Mage Advocate to return the 3 cards in my graveyard to my hand, so that he can return Vorinclex from his graveyard to the battlefield, gaining 5 life and searching his library for 2 forests, putting them into his hand. He then moves to combat and attacks Cole for 8 with the Abyssal Persecutor. On Richard's turn, he plays a Morphic Pool, then casts a Soul Ring, and follows that up by casting All Is Dust, making each player sacrifice all colored permanents they control. Notably, since the donated demons can't be sacrificed, they survive the board wipe. Once that resolves, Richard casts Animate Dead, enchanting John Arenicus in his graveyard, returning it to play and giving it -1/-0. On Cole's turn, he casts From the Rubble, choosing Dinosaur, so he returns a dinosaur from his graveyard to the battlefield with the Finality counter on it at the beginning of his end step. He attacks me for 8 with the Archfiend, drawing Richard a card, and I block with a Thopter, killing it and losing 1 life instead. Cole then moves to his end step, returning Pantlaza from his graveyard to the battlefield, discovering 4, and this lets him cast Huatli, Poet of Unity, searching his library for a basic land when it enters the battlefield, putting it into his hand. I play a Plains and recast my commander Boromir, putting Unstable Glyph Bridge into my hand, and after that I recast Ichor Wellspring, drawing a card, and move to combat and attack Richard for 2 with 2 Thopters. Doodle plays a Forest and casts Seance, letting him exile a creature from his graveyard in each upkeep, creating a token copy of it, then exiling the token in his next end step. He attacks Cole for 8 with the Abyssal Persecutor, drawing Richard a card, and at the end of turn, Richard flashes in Mithril Coat, equipping it to John Arenicus, giving him Indestructible. In Richard's upkeep, Doodle exiles Eternal Witness from his graveyard, making a token copy of it and returning Sundering Growth from his graveyard to his hand. Richard then plays a Sunken Hollow and casts Rise of the Dark Realms, returning all creatures from all graveyards to the battlefield under his control. In response, Doodle casts Sundering Growth, destroying Animate Dead, which forces Richard to sacrifice John Irenicus and creating a copy of Eternal Witness, letting him return Sundering Growth from his graveyard to his hand. Once that resolves, Doodle casts Sundering Growth again, destroying Worn Power Stone, making another copy of Eternal Witness, and returning Pulse Mage Advocate from his graveyard to his hand. Finally, the Rise of the Dark Realms resolves, with Richard getting John Irenicus, Zenic Poltergeist, Thought Monitor, drawing 2 cards, Farhaven Elf, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand, Arcanist Sowl, putting No Mercy into his hand from the top 4 cards of his library, Hulking Metamorph, which enters as a copy of his Soul Ring except it's also a 7/7 creature, Chrome Courier, having him reveal the top 2 cards of his library, putting a Dark Ritual into his hand from among them, Sai, Master Thopterist, Prowl, Stoic Strategist, Vorinclex, and Thrashing Brontodon. Once all of that has resolved, Richard casts Dark Ritual, making 3 black mana, letting him cast Ravenous Demon and immediately sacrificing Sai to transform the demon into Archdemon of Greed, making its controller sacrifice a human in their upkeep, or it taps itself and deals 9 damage to its controller. Finally, at the end of turn, Richard gives control of the Archdemon to me, tapping it, putting 2+1/+1 counters on it, and goading it. Also at the end of turn, Doodle exiles the original Eternal Witness token. On Cole's turn, he plays a mountain, then attacks Doodle for 8 with his demon, drawing Richard a card. After that, he casts Ghalta and Mavrin, discovering 12, allowing him to cast a Xenagos, God of Revels, letting him give another creature +X/+X and haste at the beginning of combat on his turn, where X is that creature's power. In my upkeep, I'm forced to sacrifice a human to the Archdemon, unfortunately sacrificing Boromir. I then move to combat and attack Cole for 11 with the Archdemon, letting Richard draw a card, and also attacking Doodle for 3 with my Thopters. In my second main phase, I cast Unstable Glyph Bridge, choosing a creature with power 2 or less for each player, and destroying all other creatures. When the board wipe resolves, the only creatures left are one of Doodle's Eternal Witness tokens, Farhaven Elf for Richard, Huatli for Cole, and Sky Scanner for myself. After that resolves, I cast a Cryptic Coat, cloaking the top card of my library so it's a 2/2 creature with Ward 2, and equipping the coat to it, giving it +1/+0 and unblockable. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Temple Garden, paying 2 life so that it comes into play untapped, and casts Eladamri's Call, searching his library for a creature, specifically Foundation Breaker, putting it into his hand. Once that resolves, Doodle also casts Panharmonicon, doubling the enter the battlefield effects of his creatures and artifacts. This lets him evoke the Foundation Breaker, destroying 2 artifacts and enchantments when it enters, destroying From the Rubble and Unstable Glyph Bridge, before sacrificing the elemental since it was evoked. In Richard's upkeep, Doodle exiles Foundation Breaker with Seance, creating a token copy of it, destroying Richard's Dimir Signet and Soul Ring. Richard then plays a Drowned Catacomb and casts Runescarred Demon, searching his library for a card and putting it into his hand. After that, he casts Phyrexian Reclamation, letting him pay 2 mana and 2 life to return a creature from his graveyard to his hand. Then at the end of turn, Doodle exiles his token copy of Foundation Breaker. Cole plays an Exotic Orchard and casts Dinosaur Egg, which has Evolve and lets Cole discover X when it dies, where X is its toughness. He then casts Rampaging Brontodon, which gets +X/+X when it attacks, where X is the number of lands that Cole controls, triggering Evolve and putting a counter on Dinosaur Egg. He then moves to combat with Xenagos triggering, giving the Brontodon +7/+7 and haste, letting him attack Doodle with it, giving it another +9/+9 on attacks. Before damage, Doodle casts Path to Exile, exiling the Brontodon, but in response to that, Richard casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, countering the Path to Exile and letting Doodle make 2 treasure tokens. This forces Doodle to block with his Eternal Witness token, killing it, still taking 22 damage through trample, going to only 2 life. In my upkeep, Doodle exiles Vorinclex from his graveyard, making a token copy of it, searching his library for 4 forests and putting them into his hand. I move straight to combat, attacking Richard for 3 with my Mysterious Creature. Then in my second main phase, I cast Against All Odds, exiling Cryptic Coat, returning it to the battlefield under my control, cloaking the top card of my library and equipping the coat to it, while also returning an artifact or creature with mana value 3 or less from my graveyard to the battlefield, returning Psi Master Thopterus to play. Once that resolves, I cast Braided Net, entering with 3 net counters, and letting me tap it and remove a net counter to tap another non-land permanent. This also triggers Psi, making me a Thopter token. Then at the end of turn, Doodle sacrifices his Vorinclex token. On Doodle's turn, he casts Mirari's Wake, letting his lands tap for an additional mana, and giving his creatures +1/+1. He then plays a forest and recasts his commander Tristani, then he also recasts Pulse Mage Advocate, gaining 8 life with Tristani. Finally, he cycles a Scattered Groves, and passes. On Richard's turn, he plays a Tainted Isle and activates Phyrexian Reclamation, losing 2 life to return John Irenicus from his graveyard to his hand. He then recasts his commander, John Irenicus, and attacks Doodle for 1 with the Farhaven Elf, but Doodle blocks it with Tristani, killing it and taking no damage. In his second main phase, Richard cast Malicious Affliction, copying it since a creature died this turn, destroying both Rampaging Brontodon and Tristani. After that, he cast a Herald of Torment, losing a life in his upkeep, and at the end of turn, Richard gives control of the Rune-Scarred Demon to me, tapping it, goading it, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it. In Cole's upkeep, Doodle exiles Farhaven Elf from his graveyard, making a token copy of it, and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Cole then cast Farseek, searching his library for a non-forest land, putting it into play tapped. After that, he recast his commander Pantlaza, evolving the Dinosaur Egg, discovering 4, and revealing Ghost Wave from his library, which he chooses to put into his hand rather than cast. On my turn, I again move straight to combat, attacking Cole for 8 and Richard for 3. In my second main phase, I cast Abuelo Ancestral Echo, letting me pay 3 mana to exile another creature or artifact, returning it to play at the beginning of the next end step. Doodle plays a forest and recasts his commander Tristani. After that, he cast Bramble Sovereign, letting him pay 2 mana when another non-token creature enters the battlefield to let its controller make a token copy of it. This also triggers Tristani, gaining him 10 life. Then he cast Woodfall Primus, destroying Phyrexian Reclamation and Ichor Wellspring when it enters the battlefield, copying it with Bramble Sovereign to destroy Prize Statue and Cavern of Souls, also gaining a total of 28 life while I draw a card and make a treasure. In Richard's upkeep, he loses a life to the Herald of Torment, then casts Shadowborn Demon, destroying Pulse Mage Advocate when it enters. After that, he casts Lightning Greaves, equipping them to the Shadowborn Demon to give it Shroud and Haste, letting Richard attack Doodle with it for 5. In his second main phase, Richard equips the Lightning Greaves to John Irenicus, letting him give control of the Shadowborn Demon to Cole, tapping it, goading it, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Before Richard's end step, I also activate Abuelo to exile one of my face-down creatures, returning it to play in his end step as an Ancient Den. In Cole's upkeep, he's forced to sacrifice a creature to the Shadowborn Demon, sacrificing the Dinosaur Egg, discovering for 5 and casting a Wayward Swordtooth from his library, letting him play an additional land each turn, also triggering Pantlaza again, discovering 5, this time casting Bronzebeak Foragers, exiling up to 1 target non-land permanent for each opponent until it leaves play, specifically exiling Seance, Skyscanner, and Lightning Greaves. After that, he casts Return of the Wildspeaker, drawing 7 cards, since he controls a creature with 7 power. When Cole moves to combat, Xenagos triggers, giving the demon +7/+7, letting him attack Doodle for 14, drawing Richard a card. Before Cole moves to his end step, I activate Abuelo again, exiling Cryptic Coat and returning it in the end step, cloaking the top card of my library and equipping the coat to it. On my turn, I play an island and attack Doodle for 8 with the demon and Richard for 3 with the Cryptic Coat creature. In my second main phase, I cast my own Panharmonicon, doubling the enter the battlefield triggers of my creatures and artifacts. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Lush Portico, surveilling 1, then activates Tristani, populating. In response, Richard cast March of Swirling Mists, phasing out both of Doodle's Woodfall Primuses and Tristani, meaning that when the populate trigger resolves, there's no token to copy, so it does nothing. Once that resolves, Doodle casts Void Winnower, copying it twice with Bramble Sovereign, preventing his opponents from casting even cost spells or blocking with even cost creatures. Before Doodle moves to his end step, I activate Abuelo, exiling the Cryptic Coat and returning it to play in his end step, and thanks to my Panharmonicon, this means I cloak the top 2 cards of my library and equip the coat to the second one that's created. In Richard's upkeep, he loses a life, then casts Urza's Incubator, naming Demon, so all demons cost 2 less to cast. After that, he cast Abhorrent Overlord, making 5 1/1 Harpy tokens when it enters, since his devotion to black is 5. He then equips the Mithril Coat to John Arenicus, giving it indestructible, and at the end of turn, Richard gives control of the Abhorrent Overlord to Cole, tapping it, goading it, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Also at the end of turn, Cole casts Ephemerate, exiling Bronzebeak Foragers and returning it to play under his control, discovering 5 and putting Path to Exile into his hand from his library. This also returns Lightning Greaves to Richard's control, Seance to Doodle's control, and Skyscanner to my control, letting me draw 2 cards. Then Cole exiles both Panharmonicons and Lightning Greaves when the Bronzebeak re-enters. In response, I activate Abuelo to exile my own Panharmonicon, returning it in Cole's end step. In Cole's upkeep, he's forced to sacrifice 2 creatures, sacrificing Huatli and Bronzebeak Foragers, returning the Greaves and Doodle's Panharmonicon to play. He also rebounds Ephemerate, exiling Wayward Swordtooth, returning it to play, discovering 5 and putting a Chroma's Will into his hand. When Cole moves to combat, he gives Shadowborn Demon +7/+7 with Xenagos, attacking Doodle for 23 damage with both his demons, drawing Richard 2 cards. In his second main phase, Cole casts Progenitor's Icon, naming Dinosaur, letting him tap it to cast a dinosaur as though it had flash. At the end of turn, my Panharmonicon returns to play. In my upkeep, Doodle exiles Pulse Mage Advocate from his graveyard, creating a token copy of it. Then I move straight to combat, attacking Doodle for 3 with my unblockable Cryptic Coat creature, and I also attack Cole for 8 with my demon. Before damage, Cole casts Path to Exile, exiling the Runescarred Demon and letting me search my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Doodle can't stop the damage going at him though, so he takes 3 and is knocked out of the game. In my second main phase, I cast Brago, King Eternal, letting me exile any number of non-land permanents I control and return them to play whenever he deals combat damage to a player. Before the end of turn, Cole cast Ghostway, exiling all his creatures and returning them to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, letting Richard make 7 more Harpies and destroy Brago when the demons re-enter, while Cole gets to discover 5, casting Cultivate from his library, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. Before Brago can be destroyed though, I activate Abuelo to exile him and return him to play at the end of turn. In Richard's upkeep, he sacrifices 2 Harpies to his demons, plays a Swamp, then casts Archfiend of Despair, making each opponent lose life in the end step equal to the life that they've lost this turn. He immediately equips it with the Lightning Greaves to give it Shroud and Haste, then moves to combat, attacking Cole for 9 with his Harpies, and attacks me for 14 with his demons. I block 2 of them with my Thopters and the Sky Scanner, only taking 3, while Cole takes all 9, getting knocked out of the game. In Richard's second main phase, he cast Arcane Signet, and before the end step, I activate Abuelo, exiling one of my mysterious creatures and returning it to play at the end of turn. Then in my end step, I lose an additional 3 life and return both Brago and Meteor Golem to the battlefield, destroying Richard's Lightning Greaves and his untapped Harpy token. On my turn, I cast Flicker Wisp, exiling both of Richard's untapped creatures until the end of turn, letting me attack him with my entire board for exactly 17 damage. Before blocks though, Richard cast Aetherize to return my attacking creatures to my hand, but since I'm able to counter it with a negate, he takes 17 damage, knocking him out, and winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. It was a very long game. That game wound up being over 2 hours long, so there was definitely a lot happening in there. But I think everybody's deck really got the chance at some point to show what it was trying to do, which is very cool. So we'll start with Doodle and then we'll kind of go around the board there. So Doodle's deck did exactly what it wanted. The fact that he was down to 2 life at one point and then get back up to 48 was very impressive. Being able to get multiple triggers from his creatures, make multiple tokens every turn, and populate every turn, it was very impressive, and there were a lot more synergies in his deck than I originally thought there were going to be when he said it was a Selesnya Reanimator deck. So I was very impressed with it, and I think it did a great job of kind of gaining life and staying relevant in the game, and also ramping. So very, very cool shout out to Doodle's deck for that one. Moving along to Richard's deck, it did, once again, exactly what it wanted to do. It played a bunch of huge demons with drawbacks and then gave them away to his opponents to haunt them. And then being able to use those demons from his opponent's point of view to attack each other and get his opponent's life totals down, put him in a position where he was very close at the end to being able to pull out the victory. And I think that if I hadn't had the counterspell at the very end for his Aetherize, he definitely would have just untapped and killed us. So he was incredibly close to winning, and the only reason he didn't is because I had that counterspell in hand. So definitely a shout out to Richard for that as well. Moving along to Cole, I think the Dinosaurs plus Blink package that he was running was very powerful. Being able to just constantly discover 5 and get more ramp and get more dinosaurs and things like that really made the deck unique, and it didn't feel like your traditional dinosaur deck where it's just dropping one giant beater into play every single turn or ramping into Gishath and then dropping a ton of stuff. It was a lot more value oriented, I think, and being able to play these big dinosaurs that then got slightly smaller dinosaurs was a super cool way to build the deck. And then, of course, finally, we got to talk about our deck being able to take down a victory in a very competitive game. I think that the value that we accrued throughout the course of the game and the fact that we didn't really look like a threat for most of it, we didn't have a ton of power on board at any given time, but we were constantly drawing cards. We were constantly triggering our Enter the Battlefield effects, and there genuinely wasn't a time in the game where I didn't have a full hand of 7 cards. So we really just kind of snuck under the radar and did exactly what our deck wanted to do. And then by the time we got to the end game and people started to realize that we were the threat, there wasn't anything that people could do to stop us. We were able to take out Doodle with our unblockable Cryptic Coat. We were able to take out Cole, well, assist in the taking out of Cole through Richard's perspective, and then just kind of steal the victory right at the end. So I think the deck did exactly what it wanted to do. It was unfortunate that we didn't get any of the Throne, Crown, or Scepter onto the battlefield. At the end of the game, we had 2 of them in hand. I was just waiting to draw the 3rd one before casting them because I didn't want to put 1 or 2 on the board and then have them get blown up and all of a sudden they're useless for the rest of the game. So I really was trying to get all 3 and we were so close. I had 2 but couldn't quite get there. But overall, that was the deck. That's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I certainly did. This one was a ton of fun to play, a ton of fun to build. So let me know down in the comments what cards you think either could be added or maybe should be taken out. And of course, if you have any suggestions for future videos, future cards you'd like me to build around, please do let me know. And as always, please do like the video. subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.